Chapter 8. Deterministic Morality. Pillar 7, 8.1. But if morality isn't objective law, how can I know that I shouldn't kick babies? Our core thesis is simple. Morality is deterministic, not objective. All moral behavior and judgments are the inevitable outcomes of prior causes, not the result of free choice or discovery of universal truths. What does this mean? It means that when you make a moral decision, you are not plucking a choice from some mystical realm of freedom. Every decision you make is an outcome of a chain of events. Your genetics, your upbringing, your culture, your current neurochemical state, all the variables that come together to produce you, also produce your choices. If we could somehow rewind the universe to the exact same initial conditions, you would make the exact same decisions every time. This includes your deepest moral convictions and the split-second choices where you decide between right and wrong. In a very real sense, you cannot do otherwise than what you do. This deterministic view might sound bleak or mechanistic, but let's unpack it step by step. Will exists, but it's entirely caused. We obviously experience making choices. Should I lie in this situation or tell the truth? Should I donate to charity or save my money? We deliberate, we feel conflicted, we exercise our will. Determinism doesn't deny the experience of choosing, it reframes it. The feeling of deliberation is your brain processing various causal inputs, weighing memories, feelings, anticipated outcomes according to its wiring. There is no separate, ghost-like free will outside this causal process. The will you experience is real, but it's a determined will, molded by everything that led up to that moment. Moral norms arise from necessity, not freedom. If our decisions are determined, then moral rules, the principles society holds to, are not freely invented either. Instead, societies develop moral norms because those norms serve a function. For example, why do virtually all societies have some form of rule against murder or theft? Not because everyone independently, freely decided yes, that is objectively wrong, but because any society that didn't discourage murder would fall apart. Certain behaviors lead to stability and prosperity, others lead to chaos. Over time, cause and effect teach any group of humans that some rules are necessary for survival. Thus, morality emerges as an effect of our circumstances. We don't choose it, we grow into it. A morality is an emergent property of deterministic systems. Just as crystal patterns emerge from the deterministic interactions of molecules, moral patterns emerge from the interactions of humans. Think of morality as akin to language. Humans did not sit down as a species and arbitrarily pick a language system. Languages evolved naturally as a solution to communication needs. They are not objectively true or false. There's no inherently truest language, but they are highly structured and rule-governed, arising from human social interaction. Morality works much the same way. It's not written into the stars, but it's also not random. It's an emergent, structured phenomenon that any sufficiently advanced social species would develop, given similar needs and constraints. Crucially, this doesn't make morality meaningless or trivial. On the contrary, it gives morality a concrete foundation in reality. Instead of being a mysterious commandment from the sky, or a purely personal opinion, morality becomes something we can study, understand, and improve upon, like any other phenomenon. If moral choices are determined, then morality is basically a branch of causality. We can analyze what causes certain moral outcomes, what rules lead to better societal functioning, and so on, with the same empirical mindset we bring to biology or physics. To say morality is deterministic is also to say moral responsibility takes on a new meaning. It's not about a metaphysical freedom to have done otherwise. It's about being the link in a chain that leads to certain outcomes. We still hold people responsible in the sense that their actions have consequences, and we often must address those actions. But we no longer see responsibility as a moral weight on a soul. Instead, it is a pragmatic identification of cause and effect. If someone's action caused harm, we respond not because they freely chose evil, but because we want to prevent such harm in the future, or correct the conditions that led to it. This core thesis, that morality is a determined, emergent system, turns the traditional view on its head. Traditionally, people assume morality is only meaningful if we have free will, and if some things are objectively right or wrong. We are now proposing the exact opposite. Morality actually becomes clearer and more coherent once we accept that it's entirely determined and not objectively mandated. But to appreciate that, we must first deal with the big elephant in the room, free will. After all, if free will doesn't exist, what happens to the idea of choosing to do right or wrong? Let's confront that directly. 8.2, the illusion of free will and the collapse of moral blame. Just heard them because it feels good, not because it solves anything. One of the strongest intuitive objections to a deterministic morality is, doesn't morality require free will? If nobody has free choice, how can anyone be blamed or praised? How can we have things like justice, or moral effort, or the sense of duty? These questions are valid. Entire moral philosophies are built on the assumption of free will. However, if free will is an illusion, then those philosophies need a complete overhaul. And indeed, free will is an illusion, at least in the traditional sense of an uncaused chooser inside us. Let's clarify what we mean by free will being an illusion. In the classic view, free will means that at any given moment, a person could have done otherwise than what they did, independent of all prior causes. It posits a kind of mental spontaneity that is neither random nor determined, a magical ability to just choose. Determinism flatly denies this. Every action you take is the only action you could have taken, given the circumstances. This is not to say you were coerced by an external force in that moment, but rather that you, your brain, your psyche, were always going to make exactly that choice because of who you are and what you knew and felt at that time, all of which are products of prior causes. Consider a simple example. A teenager commits an act of vandalism. Traditional thinking might say they knew it was wrong but freely chose to do it, so they are morally blameworthy. A deterministic view says, what factors led this teenager to that action? Perhaps a need for peer approval, a lack of understanding of consequences, an impulsive personality shaped by genetics and upbringing, etc. If we rewind the scenario with all those factors unchanged, do we really think the teenager would spontaneously choose not to vandalize? Likely not. They did it because of those influencing factors. No spooky free will needed. A cause and effect chain explains it. Science bolsters this view. Neurological studies have shown that the brain initiates actions before our conscious mind decides to do them, indicating that our feeling of freely willing an action is a reconstruction, not the actual origin. Psychological studies show how people's choices can be predicted, above chance, by their patterns of past behavior and environmental cues. Even our deepest sense of self, the kind of person we strive to be, is shaped by genes and experiences, none of which we chose before we existed. Now, if we accept that free will, in the strong metaphysical sense, doesn't exist, what happens to moral responsibility? At first glance, it seems to collapse entirely. Traditional moral responsibility is built on the idea that an individual could have done otherwise. We praise the hero because he didn't have to risk himself to save others, but he chose to. We blame the villain because she could have done good, but she chose evil. Remove the could have. And those judgments falter if the hero literally could not have acted differently, because every neuron in his brain, every aspect of his character, determined that he would act heroically. Then is heroism really something to praise, in the sense of taking personal credit? It's admirable and beneficial, yes, but praise in the sense of you deserve a reward, because you went above and beyond what was required no longer applies. He acted as he was bound to act. If the criminal could not have refrained from crime, given her life circumstances, psychology, etc., then blaming and punishing in the sense of you chose wrong and must suffer for it loses justification. The criminal did wrong, but not as a freely willing sinner, more like a faulty cog in a machine or a boulder that rolled down a hill and crushed something in its path. You don't morally blame the boulder, you figure out why it rolled and how to prevent future rock slides. This realization leads to a dramatic shift. Retributive justice becomes irrational under determinism. Retribution means inflicting suffering on someone because they deserve it for making a bad choice. But if there was no true free choice, the notion of desert, what one deserves, is fundamentally altered. Does a person deserve punishment in a cosmic moral sense if their actions were the product of a million antecedent causes? We would argue no. Punishment might still have a role, more on that later, but not as moral retribution. Even many who believe in free will already intuit parts of this. Consider how our legal systems handle people with severe mental illness. If someone commits a harmful act, but is found to be psychotic or not in control of their mind, we often judge them not guilty by reason of insanity. Why? Because we implicitly recognize that their action did not flow from a free conscious choice in the normal way. It was caused by factors, brain chemistry, delusions, outside what we consider the person's control. In other words, we acknowledge determinism's impact in extreme cases by saying the person lacked full responsibility. But here's the rub. All actions are caused by something. The difference between the sane and the insane, or the well-raised and the badly raised, is a difference in the causes, not a difference between having causes or not. So if we admit that a schizophrenic's violent act was not a freely chosen evil, why do we insist that a clear-headed criminal's act was freely chosen? The clear-headed criminal's choices were shaped by their brain state, life history, and circumstances just as much. The chain of causality is simply more socially typical. This illustrates a key point, even under free will-based frameworks. Whenever we acknowledge that circumstances influence behavior, we are halfway to a deterministic view. Many traditional moralists want to have it both ways. Normal people have free will and deserve what they get, except if factors A, B, or C impaired their judgment. But once you let A, B, and C, be it mental illness or abuse history or social pressure, into the equation, you're admitting that causality matters. Deterministic morality just carries this reasoning to its logical conclusion. Causality is all that matters. Moral responsibility, in the old sense, as a metaphysical guilt or merit, evaporates completely. What collapses along with it are praise and blame as we traditionally conceive them. This can be unsettling. Do we not thank and laud people who do good? Do we not hold people accountable for doing bad? The deterministic view doesn't say we must stop reacting emotionally to good or bad deeds. Those reactions are determined too. But it says we should reinterpret what those reactions mean. Instead of praising someone as a hero who could have selfishly fled but bravely didn't, we are expressing appreciation for the positive impact of their determined character and actions, reinforcing those behaviors in society. Instead of blaming someone as a villain who perversely chose harm, we express disapproval to signal that such behavior has no place in society and to motivate corrective measures. In both cases, we're doing it for functional reasons, not because we're delivering cosmic justice. In summary, free will's absence radically changes our moral calculus. No one could have done otherwise. This means no one is fundamentally blameworthy or praiseworthy for being exactly who they are. You did what you had to do, and so did everyone else. Retribution is unjustified. Punishing people purely to give them what they deserve makes no sense when what they deserve wasn't up to them. The only rationales for punishment that remain are those that serve some forward-looking purpose, deterrence, rehabilitation, or incapacitation to protect others. Praise and blame become tools, not truths. We might still use the language of praise or blame, but with the understanding that we are like trainers rewarding a dog or correcting behavior, not like judges weighing independent free choices. This shift is profound. It takes morality off the pedestal of metaphysics and plants it squarely in the realm of natural cause and effect. The old framework has indeed collapsed. We cannot keep talking about morality the way we used to. But this is not the end of ethics, far from it. In losing the illusion of free will, we gain a new perspective on why morality matters and how it operates. We start focusing on outcomes and causes instead of intent and sin. We start asking what will reduce harm or increase well-being going forward, instead of who deserves to be punished or rewarded for what they've done. Most importantly, we don't actually lose the experience of decision-making or the need to guide behavior. We still have goals, we still deliberate on how to achieve them, and we still need principles to coordinate our actions with others. Determinism doesn't make us passive robots. It just tells us why we do what we do. In fact, it empowers us to do better once we understand those determinants. This leads us to the next key idea. Even without free will, morality not only persists, it thrives as a concept of practical necessity. 8.3. Morality as an emergent necessity. Why morality still matters. So free will is an illusion and objective morality is a myth. Does this mean morality is out the window as well? Should. We all become nihilists, claiming nothing matters, and there's no reason to prefer kindness over cruelty. Absolutely not. Morality remains vitally important, but its importance comes not from obeying some cosmic law or exercising free choice, rather from the pragmatic needs of living in a determined reality. The key realization is that even a world without free will needs ethical behavior. Why? Because actions still have consequences. We are still beings with desires, capable of suffering and joy, living together in societies. None of that is negated by determinism. If anything, determinism makes those realities more stark, given that things will unfold cause by cause. If we want good outcomes, we have to intentionally cultivate the right causes. Morality, then, becomes the study and practice of influencing outcomes for the better. Think of morality as a social technology, a set of rules and norms that human groups develop in order to function. Every society has something we'd recognize as morality, because any society that completely lacked norms would tear itself apart. This is not because the universe commands thou shalt have morality, but because of natural selection and necessity, a community that allowed limitless murder, theft, deceit, etc. would not last. Moral norms emerge because they make societies viable. In this sense, morality is comparable to language, money, or laws, human constructs, but indispensable ones. We made them up, but not arbitrarily. We made them up under pressure from reality. Some points to underscore why morality still matters, and isn't just imaginary. Stability and survival are non-negotiable. Humans, and any agents, are deterministically driven to survive, avoid pain, and seek well-being. These drives are built into us by evolution and conditioning. We don't choose them. Given those drives, certain patterns of behavior, moral ones like cooperation, nonviolence, fairness, naturally, promote stability and thriving, whereas rampant violence and betrayal do not. So even without any objective decree, there's a deterministic push towards moral behavior. Groups that figure out cooperative rules will outlast and outperform those that don't. In this way, morality is an inevitable product of our situation, an emergent property of human interaction that serves our determined interests. Ought arises from I is, when the IS includes our needs. In a vacuum, it's true you can't say people ought to do X just from facts, but in reality there is never a vacuum. The facts always include what people want and need. We'll delve deeper into I's vs ought in the next section, but the short version is because we factually are the kinds of beings who prefer certain states of the world. Statements about what we ought to do can be interpreted as statements about how to achieve those preferred states. For instance, people ought not torture each other isn't an objective cosmic truth, but it's a very sensible rule given that A, people universally suffer from extreme pain, fact, and B, we seek to avoid suffering, another fact. It's a rule that deterministic forces, our biology and social dynamics, make us value. Immorality is about prediction and control, not blame. Instead of viewing morality as a ledger of credits and debits on people's souls, we view it as a kind of predictive science. We want to know, if we encourage action A, what will happen? If we discourage action B, what will happen? Moral principles become like hypotheses about social cause and effect. For example, if we foster trust and punish lying, our community will prosper. That's a testable claim in a way. And indeed, over centuries, humans have empirically found that certain moral arrangements produce better outcomes, more peace, more prosperity. So morality still matters because it's the guiding system for human flourishing. We ignore it at our peril, not because of divine wrath, but because of natural consequences. Emergent does not mean arbitrary. A common misconception: if morality isn't objective, then it's just anything goes. But just because something is a human construct doesn't mean all constructs are equal. Chess is a human construct. Someone made up the rules, but not any random set of rules makes a playable game. Language is constructed, but you can't just randomly assign sounds to meanings and expect to communicate. Languages evolve under constraints and pressures, ease of learning, distinctiveness of words, etc. Likewise, moral systems are constrained by human nature and the realities of cause and effect. There is a structured, limited space of viable moral systems, and we can objectively study which ones lead to which results. In that sense, morality can be seen as subjective in origin, but objective in operation. We invent a rule, and then it either works, contributes to well-being, stability, or it doesn't, based on objective outcomes. Over time, the rules that work tend to stick around. This is why independent cultures often converge on similar basic moral tenets. Don't kill, don't steal, value honesty, not because these are written in the stars, but because those are the functional solutions in any human society. To drive home the point, morality is real, but its reality is that of an emergent pattern, not a fundamental law. Consider the example of, if you want a stable society, you ought to discourage random violence. This statement requires no appeal to higher authority. It's practically tautological once you understand the terms. A stable society, by definition, cannot coexist with unchecked violence. We don't need to say violence is cosmically evil. It's enough that violence causes suffering and chaos, facts, and that humans avoid suffering and chaos, fact. Thus, a norm against violence emerges inexorably. You could drop a human community on a desert island, and given enough time, they will develop rules. And almost certainly, don't murder will be among them. Not because someone pontificated from first principles, but because if they don't, they won't survive as a community. It's worth noting that existential logicism's deterministic morality navigates between two extremes. It avoids the trap of moral objectivism, pretending moral laws exist outside of human contexts, and equally avoids the abyss of moral subjectivism where anything goes. We reject moral objectivism because of the contingency argument. We know moral rules need minds and context. But we also reject the idea that morality is just whimsical or purely personal choice. A person can believe whatever they want about right and wrong, but if their beliefs don't align with the deterministic realities of human social life, those beliefs will fail the test of implementation. For example, someone might claim, I think strength is the only virtue and kindness is weakness, but if they try to structure a society that way, it will likely collapse or be plagued by violence. In a very real sense, morality is constrained by what reality allows. There is a natural spectrum of moral strategies that work for creatures like us, and straying too far outside that, either into cruel tyranny or into anarchy or what have you, typically leads to self-destruction of that society. Thus, morality may be subjective in its starting point. It starts from human needs and perspectives, but it is objective in its consequences. Some moral arrangements objectively produce better results given those starting points. In summary, morality matters without free will because morality was never fundamentally about free will in the first place. It was about navigating a world of causes and effects to achieve what we care about: peace, happiness, life. Those cares are determined, the navigation can be studied, and the stakes are real. The illusion was thinking that morality needed some metaphysical freedom or external validation to function. It doesn't. As determined beings, we still need to know how to live together and prosper, and deterministic moral forces give us a way to understand that process. Having established that an ethics grounded in determinism is both necessary and meaningful, we can now tackle a claim that few philosophies dare to: bridging the gap between is and ought. In our framework, the so-called gap is not a chasm at all, but a continuum, because what includes the seeds of what we call ought. 8.4 Formal Derivation for Deterministic Moral Forces, DMF. In the main Deterministic Moral Forces chapter, Existential Logicism argues that all moral behavior, moral judgment, and systems of punishment are products of deterministic forces. Once we combine I, the deterministic engine of the persistent present; 2, the mind dependence of morality established by the contingency guillotine; and the second, the spectrum of consciousness picture of valuing systems, the traditional notion of objective, retributive moral desert becomes incoherent. This appendix makes that structure explicit. Deterministic background and agents. We first fix the deterministic setting inherited from the persistent present chapter. Definition 8.1. Deterministic world. Let S be a non-empty set of possible complete present states, and T a linearly ordered index set, times. A deterministic world is a sequence W equal to STS or TT, together with an evolution function, FSS, such that for every TT there is a successor, TT with SNT equal to F SNT. Intuitively, the world is always in some complete present configuration ST. And given that configuration, there is a single next configuration, even if observers lack the information to predict it. This is the persistent present determinism engine. Reality only ever exists as finite present states, and their succession is fixed by F definition 8.2 agent. An agent in a deterministic world W is a subsystem A of each world state equipped with 1. An internal state SAT at each time T. 2. A valuational structure val A, encoding how it ranks possible conditions, drives, goals, aversions, projects. 3. Input-output relations with its environment NVA T, such that its observable behavior at T, BAT, is given by a deterministic function, BAT equal to GASA T, NVA T. Humans, many non-human animals, and suitably structured artificial systems are all instances of such agents. Remark 803. Agents as valuers, not metaphysical exceptions. By the spectrum of consciousness and contingency guillotine pillars, agents are understood as valuers, systems that rank and pursue states of affairs according to Valet. Nothing, in this definition, grants them any special metaphysical status, such as a soul outside of causality. They are complex deterministic subsystems within W free will under the persistent present. We now make precise the notion of contra-causal free will that deterministic moral forces rejects. Definition 8.4. Contra-causal free will. An agent A has contra-causal free will, CCFW, at time T if and only if holding fixed 1. The complete present world states T, and 2. The evolution function F. There are at least 2 distinct possible behaviors B1 equal to B2 such that 1. Both B1 and B2 are available to A at T in the sense that they are treated by A as open options, and 2. Which of Bone or B2 is realized is not fixed by F, SD, but is instead ultimately settled by A from outside the causal structure encoded in F. This is the standard libertarian notion of free will. An agent is an originator of action whose choice is not wholly determined by prior states. Lemma 8.1. No contra-causal free will under determinism. In a deterministic world, as in definition 8.1, no agent has contra-causal free will in the sense of definition 8.4. Proof. Fix any time T in world state, saint by determinism, the next state equal to F set T, is uniquely determined. The behavior of any agent A at T is part of sent, and thus is uniquely determined by sent and F. There is no pair of genuinely open behaviors Bone equal to B2, both compatible with the same ST and F. Hence the conditions for CCFW are never met. Corollary 8.5. No ultimate source of action. In a deterministic world, no agent is the ultimate uncaused source of its behavior at any time. Proof. Any behavior BA, T, arises from SAT, and NVA, T, via GA, and these states in turn arise from earlier world states under F. At no point does a step outside this chain to originate a behavior ex nihilo. Combined with lemma 8.1, there is no coherent sense in which A is an ultimate source. Remark 8.6. Determinism is not fatalism. Determinism, as formalized in definition 8.1, does not entail fatalism. Fatalism holds that outcomes will occur regardless of what agents do. Determinism holds that what agents do is itself part of the causal structure that produces outcomes. Under deterministic moral forces, agents' deliberations, emotions, and efforts are among the deterministic forces that shape the future. They are not rendered idle by the absence of CCFW. Moral judgments and punishment as outputs of valuing systems. We now treat moral language and sanctions as outputs of valuing agents and social systems. Definition 8.7. Moral judgment. A moral judgment at time T is an output token judge A, T, of some agent or community A, such as B was wrong. A ought not do that again, or this action is morally required. Formally, judge AT is part of BAT. Definition 8.8. Punishment and sanction. A punishment or sanction at time T is an imposed negative consequence puna T, directed at some agent or subsystem because of a behavior attributed to it at some earlier time TT. This includes legal penalties, social exclusion, reputational harm, and other structured responses. Lemma 8.2. Moral judgments are deterministic outputs. In a deterministic world, Any moral judgment judge A, T, is a deterministic output of the agent's prior evaluative state and environment. Proof. By definition 8.2, Bay A, T, which includes judge A, T, is given by Gay, Sa T, NVA T, both Sa T and NVA T, are determined by earlier world states under F. Thus, judge A, T is fixed once NT is fixed. There is no additional contra-causal factor. Lemma 8.3, punishment practices and their causal roles. In a deterministic world populated by valuing agents, any punishment or sanction practice is sustained over time only insofar as it plays some causal role in the network of agents' valuational structures and institutions. Typical roles include deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, norm signaling, consolidation of power, and gratification of retributive emotions. Proof. Consider any punishment practice P, for example a legal penalty scheme or an informal social shaming pattern. Maintaining P consumes resources and has effects on agent states, including their expectations and emotions. In a deterministic world of valuers, whether P persists is itself determined by its causal interactions with those valuational structures and institutions. Practices whose net effects consistently frustrate the valuations of sufficiently many agents, for example by generating widespread instability or unbearable suffering, will be under pressure, again deterministic not teleological, to change or vanish. Agents and institutions that sustain such practices will face countervailing forces. Conversely, practices that feed into existing valuations by reducing feared harms, signaling norms, entrenching power, or satisfying retributive desires will tend to be reinforced and reproduced. At no point in this explanatory story do we need to posit an additional stance-free property of deserving suffering. The persistence and form of P are fully accounted for in terms of causal roles within the valuational ecology. Remark 8.9, mind dependence from the contingency guillotine. By the contingency guillotine, there are no strongly objective, mind-independent moral properties such as being absolutely deserving of suffering. Moral predicates only acquire content relative to the valuational structures, valet, of agents and communities. Lemmas 8.2 and 8.3, therefore, show that what we call moral judgment and punishment are patterns in the dynamics of valuing systems, not responses to independent moral facts, written into the fabric of reality. Deterministic moral forces, explanatory sufficiency. We can now state the central explanatory result. Theorem 8.4, explanatory sufficiency of deterministic moral forces. Let W be a deterministic world as in definition 8.1, populated by agents as in definition 8.2. Then, 1. All agent behaviors, including those labeled moral or immoral, are fully determined by prior states of W2. All moral judgments and punishment practices are deterministic outputs of agents' valuational structures and social dynamics. 3. Consequently, there is no explanatory need to posit contra-causal free will or stance-free moral desert in order to account for moral behavior, moral language, or systems of punishment. Proof. 1. By definition 8.1, each present state sent fixes st equal to f sent. By definition 8.2, the behavior of any agent A at time t is a component of sent and is given by Ga, Sa T, NVA T. Thus every behavior is determined by prior states of W. 2. Moral judgments, judge A, T, are part of Be A, T, and hence determined as in Lemma 802. Punishments and sanctions, Punar T, are likewise behaviors of agents, individual or institutional, and so are deterministic outputs of their states. Over time, the persistence and form of punishment practices are constrained by their causal roles, as in Lemma 8.3. 3. Items 1 and 2 show that the totality of moral behavior, judgment, and punishment is already fully captured by the deterministic dynamics of valuing systems. Introducing contra-causal freedom, or stance-free desert, would not add any explanatory power to this account. It would simply be an additional label placed on certain nodes in the causal network. Eliminating stance-free desert, given the contingency guillotine. The previous theorem is purely explanatory. To go further, we invoke the earlier contingency guillotine pillar. Definition 8.10, stance-free moral property. A stance-free moral property would be a property of actions or agents, for example, being objectively wrong or deserving suffering, that obtains independently of any valuer's attitudes, standards, or conceptual scheme. The contingency guillotine chapter argues that no such properties exist. Every candidate analysis of an objective moral property smuggles in contingent value dependence. Theorem 8.5, elimination of stance-free moral desert. Assume the setting of theorem 8.4 and the mind dependence result of the contingency guillotine, that is that there are no stance-free moral properties then. 1. No agent possesses contra-causal free will or is an ultimate source of action. Lemma 8.1. Corollary 8.5. 2. No action or agent instantiates a stance-free property of deserving suffering or being objectively guilty. Remark 829. 3. Therefore, traditional retributive desert, understood as a stance-free moral property that would justify suffering purely in virtue of a past action, cannot be made coherent within the existential logicism framework. Proof. 1 and 2. Restate earlier results in this deterministic setting. For 3, note that retributive desert in the classical sense requires both I, that the agent freely chose the action in, the contra-causal sense, and 2, that there exists a stance-free fact that they now deserve suffering, but I is ruled out by lemma 8.1 and corollary 805, and second is incompatible with the contingency guillotine. Thus retributive desert has no available foundation here. Any residual appeal to desert reduces to a reflection of agent's valuational states and must be assessed in terms of its causal effects, not as a response to an independent moral property. Corollary 8.1% 1. Responsibility as causal locus. In a deterministic moral framework, the only coherent sense in which an agent is responsible for an action is as a causal locus in the chain of events leading to that action. Holding an agent responsible means identifying it as a point at which interventions, sanctions, therapy, education, changes in environment can be applied to influence future outcomes. Proof. Since agents are not ultimate sources of their behavior, corollary 8.5, responsibility cannot mean being an uncaused origin of action. Nevertheless, agents occupy identifiable positions in the causal network. Their internal states and outputs mediate between past and future events. To hold responsible in this framework is to exploit that mediation point to effect change. This notion is compatible with theorems 8.4 and 8.5, and does not reintroduce CCFW or stance-free desert. Remark 8.12. Compatibilist free will. Some compatibilist accounts of free will redefine freedom in terms of acting in accordance with one's reasons and desires, without external coercion. The present framework is compatible with using such labels for certain deterministic patterns of agency. What it denies is that any such compatibilist notion can ground ultimate, stance-free moral desert. Even if an agent acts from its own reasons, those reasons are themselves products of prior causes and valuational structures. Remark 8.13. Randomness and moral agency. If there is genuine randomness at some physical scale, it does not rescue. Contra-causal freedom. A random deviation in behavior is not more owned by an agent than a determined one. It is simply less predictable. Thus, injecting randomness into the dynamics of W cannot restore the notion of ultimate desert that theorem 8.5 shows to be incoherent. Is ought representation under deterministic moral forces? We now make explicit how deterministic moral forces handles ought talk. The key move is analytic. We treat ought as a shorthand for a structured relation between valuations, beliefs, and the deterministic dynamics of the world. Definition. 8.1 4. Belief state and option set. For an agent A at time t, let Bella t encode the agent's informational state, their model of which world trajectories are possible, and let actse t be the set of actions the agent treats as available at t in deliberation. Definition 8.15. Valuationally relative ought. Fix an agent A at time t with valuational structure valet, belief state Bella t, and option set axa t. For any action, A axa t, we say that. Oughta A holds, read, A ought, at t, to do A. Relative to valet and Bella. T if and only if, for every alternative B axa t, the world trajectories that A, possibly imperfectly, expects to follow from doing A are ranked by valor, at least as highly as those expected to follow from doing B. Intuitively, A is an valor maximizing option among the actions the agent currently regards as open, given what they deterministically believe about how the world works. Theorem 8.6 is ought representation. In the setting above, any statement of the form A ought, at T, to do A as understood in the deterministic moral forces framework is analytically equivalent to a purely descriptive statement about 1. The agent's valuational structure valor 2. The agent's belief state Bella T 3. The option set axa T and 4. The deterministic dynamics F of W as encoded in those beliefs. There is no further stance-free ought fact in addition to these ingredients. Proof. By definition 8.15, the truth conditions for A ought, at T, to do A are exactly that a B and valor maximizing option among the actions in axa T, relative to the trajectories the agent expects given Bella T. But this condition is a conjunction of descriptive facts about valet, Bella T, and acts A, T, together with the way these encode expectations about F. Thus, once one has fixed the non-moral facts about valuations, beliefs, options, and world dynamics, there is nothing left for ought to add. To assert that oughta A holds is simply to assert that those non-moral facts stand in the specified relation. Remark 8.16. Relation to Hume's is ought problem. Hume's challenge was that one cannot validly infer an ought from a mere list of IS statements unless a normative premise is smuggled in. The deterministic moral forces move is not to infer a new kind of non-natural stance-free ought from purely natural facts. Instead, it is to analyze the relevant oughtas already being a complex natural fact about valuations, beliefs, options, and dynamics. The apparent gap closes because the supposed extra ought never existed as an independent kind of fact. Remark 8.17. Subjectivism, nihilism, and deterministic moral forces. In this framework, moral claims are mind-dependent. Without valuers, there are no moral properties at all. This does not make morality arbitrary or trivial. Valuational structures are heavily constrained by biology, environment, social feedback, and the realities of suffering. Stable moral patterns are precisely those that robustly emerge under these constraints. Deterministic moral forces is therefore neither naive subjectivism, anything goes, nor moral nihilism. Nothing matters. It is a deterministic, mind-dependent account of why some moral systems actually take hold and others do not. Remark 8.18. From description to guidance. While theorems 8.4, 8.5, and 8.6 are descriptive, they support a practical shift. Moral and legal systems should be evaluated from within the valuational standpoint of agents who care about suffering, stability, and flourishing. By how effectively they harness deterministic moral forces to reduce preventable harm and support more coherent futures. This aligns with the main chapter's move from a retributive, sin-based model to a forward-looking engineering model of ethics and justice, without reintroducing any objective moral law or contra-causal freedom. 8.5% bridging the is-ought divide. Build bridges, don't burn them. Philosophers have long been haunted by the gulf between describing the world and prescribing how it should be. In our deterministic framework, we have a fresh angle on this old problem. The trick is understanding that once you strip away the mystique around ought statements can be seen as a special kind of is statement, specifically an is statement about what will reliably lead to desired outcomes. To say you ought to do X traditionally implies some independent moral imperative. But in a deterministic system, we reinterpret it as shorthand for a chain of cause and effect facts. If you do X, then given the way the world works, outcome Y will occur, which we deterministically desire or value. Therefore, you, if you are an agent who desires Y, will be driven to do 10th. It sounds a bit convoluted, but it's actually much more intuitive in practice. Let's break down the logic stepwise to see how an ought can emerge from pure facts. 1. Agents have inherent goals and needs. It is the case that humans, as well as any similar agents, strive for certain things: survival, safety, well-being, social belonging. We don't choose to have these basic drives. They come built in from biology and socialization. This is a factual statement about what humans are like. 2. Certain actions reliably lead toward or away from those goals. It is the case that some behaviors produce outcomes that fulfill human needs, and others produce outcomes that thwart them. For instance, it is the case that a society in which people habitually murder each other will be unstable and full of fear, contrary to the goal of safety. It is the case that if people generally keep their promises, trust and cooperation become possible, aiding well-being and social harmony. 3. Societies and individuals naturally form norms based on those cause and effect relationships. It is the case that over time, communities develop rules like don't kill and keep your promises precisely because those rules serve the outcomes everyone inherently wants. These norms are not arbitrary. They are molded by the pressure of reality. Even if no one initially articulated you ought not kill, people who gratuitously kill would face backlash and exclusion because their actions have negative effects. Thus, behavioral norms against killing take shape. This is a descriptive account of norm formation. Now we phrase the prescription, you ought not do 10th. What this really means in our framework is doing X will lead to outcomes that undermine the shared needs and desires that you and everyone have. Therefore, by the logical structure of those needs, you will be punished or see harm if you do 10th. In other words, given what is true about your nature and the world, you should avoid X if you want things to go well. And since wanting things to go well is not optional, it's determined by our nature, the ought carries force. It's inescapable in context. Let's use a concrete example to illustrate this derivation. Fact 1. Humans living in society benefit from security and trust. We are safer and happier when we don't fear being harmed by others. Fact 2. Random murder undermines security and trust, leading to chaos and suffering. Fact 3, therefore, any society of humans will enforce, through determined reactions, a norm against murder to maintain stability. People who murder will face consequences, legal punishment, community retaliation, etc., because of how humans collectively respond to protect themselves. Conclusion, ought. If you are a human in society, which means you are subject to those collective forces, and you yourself need the society to be stable, you ought not to murder. This ought isn't coming from a mystical moral realm. It's coming from the very practical reality that murdering will bring about your own ruin and others as well. It's a conditional ought with universally true conditions. Virtually everyone wants to live and not be murdered. And that doesn't hinge on personal opinion. It's a feature of human organisms. Notice that we didn't slip in any new value beyond what is already implicit in the facts. We didn't say life is sacred, or murder is inherently evil. We said, we want to live, a fact. Murder causes instability and death, a fact. Therefore, we form a norm against murder, a fact. And so anyone who contemplates murder ought to expect negative consequences and the destruction of what they care about. In this way, the ought becomes nothing more and nothing less than a recognition of the deterministic forces at play. It is correct, as a matter of fact, to say, you ought not murder. In the same way, it's correct to say, if you touch a hot stove, you'll burn yourself. So you shouldn't do that. The shouldn't is not an independent moral truth. It's advice derived from cause and effect. Yet it carries a normative weight, because we all have skin in the game. Literally, in the stove example, and figuratively in society's case. To put this formally, consider the following chain of reasoning in our deterministic moral framework. 1. It is the case that humans, as determined beings, strive for certain conditions: survival, stability, well-being. 2. It is the case that certain actions, like widespread violence or deceit, reliably lead to the breakdown of those conditions. 3. It is the case that humans collectively develop pressures, laws, punishments, moral disapproval to discourage those detrimental actions and encourage behaviors that support survival and stability. 4. Therefore, it is the case that any given individual human exists under those pressures and with those innate drives. 5. Therefore, that individual ought to avoid the detrimental actions, because everything in their reality, from their own needs to society's responses, pushes toward avoiding those actions. Step 5 is an ought that has been entirely derived from a series of I.S. statements. It does not require us to appeal to any value outside the system. The values, survival, etc. are themselves facts of what humans are. The ought is essentially an emergent property of a cluster of is statements. It's like saying, given what a heart is and does, it ought to pump blood, meaning if it doesn't, the organism will suffer. No one would say a failing heart is immoral, but we can certainly say it's not doing what it ought to for the organism to live. In moral context, ought has that same functional character in our view. It's important to stress that this resolves Hume's problem, Hume 2007, in a practical sense, but we are not claiming to have created an objective moral truth out of thin air. Rather, we've shown that when you fully account for reality, including human nature, the separation between facts and values diminishes. Values themselves are a kind of fact, facts about what creatures desire. And once those are on the table, bridging to an ought is no leap at all. Hume's point was that you can't get an ought from an is if you ignore the implicit wants or goals. We are simply putting those wants explicitly into the equation and showing that, within a deterministic framework, those wants are non-optional. One could object, isn't this just a hypothetical imperative? If you want X, then you ought to do Y. What if I don't want X? In our framework, for fundamental things like survival and avoiding pain, not wanting X is generally not an option for any functioning human. You can say you don't care about living or stability, but as long as you behave like a human, your biology and subconscious will assert those drives. And indeed, if someone truly lacks all the usual human drives, say they have a condition that makes them feel no pain, no fear of death, etc., then moral communication with them fails in any framework, not just ours. They become something like an alien or a psychopath with whom negotiation is extremely difficult. The deterministic framework doesn't magically convert those who fundamentally don't share human drives. It just speaks to the vast majority of us who do. Another objection might be, but what if someone's mind goal is something awful, like they want chaos or enjoy causing pain? There are two responses. First, such desires usually stem from some pathology or extreme circumstance, deterministic causes we might address or treat. Second, even if an individual here or there wants chaos, the rest of society's deterministic forces, our combined desire for stability, will check that individual. They will either be stopped, isolated, or their behavior rendered costly to them. So the ought for them, you ought not cause chaos, is enforced by reality in the form of consequences, even if they personally don't subscribe to it. They might not agree, but they can't escape the reality that trying to live by a contrary ought, like I ought to sow chaos, will bring them into conflict with larger forces and likely lead to their own ruin. Thus, the deterministic ought proves itself inexorable. Ignore it at your peril. In effect, we've made moral oughts into a subset of practical rationality. If you understand how the world works, you'll see that you ought to behave in certain ways to get the results you, ineluctably, want. This approach means we haven't invented any new moral commandment. We've only clarified why moral imperatives have the force they do. They feel compelling, not because they float down from heaven, but because they are wired into the consequence matrix of our lives. It is, in a sense, reassuring. You don't follow morality to appease a god or an abstraction. You follow it because it's the roadmap to a functioning society and personal well-being. And those are the things you care about, because you're human. Let's wrap this up with a powerful metaphor: the rock rolling down the hill. If a boulder is tumbling toward a village, we don't pause to ask what the rock ought to do, or blame the rock for being bad. We simply act. The rock must be diverted or stopped to prevent harm. Now consider a human who is on a path, due to whatever causes, to do violence or cause harm. In the old framework, we'd say he ought not do that, and if he does, we blame and punish. In the deterministic framework, that statement, he ought not, is more like a warning, if he. Continues. The deterministic forces of society, police, etc., will stop him or punish him. And a lot of suffering will happen. It's a predictive statement. His action is against the collective stability, and thus will meet resistance. Ideally, we stop it before it happens, just as we would with the rock. In this way, ought becomes almost interchangeable with necessary if we want to avoid disaster. We have effectively solved the as-ought divide problem by dissolving it. Oughts are not mysterious extra properties. They are embedded in the fabric of IS. Once this includes all relevant facts about human nature and goals. We no longer have to smuggle in values surreptitiously. We acknowledge them as determined facts and proceed logically. This careful framing shows that our approach offers a compelling resolution to a centuries-old philosophical puzzle. But we emphasize that this is a byproduct of our system, not a proclamation of absolute truth. We have not declared thou shalt not murder as an objective law. We have explained why you ought not murder will hold as a rule in any human context. That is immensely powerful, arguably more powerful than an objective law, because it does not rely on faith in something unseen. It relies only on understanding the reality of human life. With this understanding of how morality can be grounded in determinism, we can more confidently contrast our framework with the traditional moral doctrines it aims to replace. It is time to show how deterministic moral forces transcends the old ethical systems, deontological, utilitarian, religious, resolving their contradictions and pitfalls. 8.6 Transcending Traditional Ethics, Why Determinism Outperforms Old Doctrines. Most established ethical theories were built on the foundations we have just shaken, free will and objective values. It is no surprise, then, that those theories encounter serious problems. By viewing morality through the deterministic lens, we can see why those traditional frameworks fail and how our approach avoids their traps. Let us briefly examine a few of these classic systems. Kantian deontology, duty ethics, Kant 1998 billions. Immanuel Kant argued that moral duties are grounded in rationality and must hold universally for all free rational agents. His famous categorical imperative says that we should act only on those maxims that we could coherently will as universal laws. The glaring issue here is the assumption of free, rational agency. Kant's whole moral castle is built on the idea that we can choose to follow duty out of pure reason. If, as we have argued, no one truly has the freedom to do otherwise than they do, then Kant's imperative loses its footing. There are no absolutely free, rational agents in our world, only determined ones. Does that make Kantian rules useless? Not entirely. One can still find pragmatic value in, say, the rule "do not lie," because it leads to trust. But the justification for following the rule is different. Kant wanted it to be an unconditional logical requirement. Deterministic moral forces says it is a conditional, causal necessity. Kantian ethics also struggles with conflicts of duties and often ignores outcomes entirely. For Kant, lying was wrong even to save a life, a rigid stance many find counterintuitive. Our framework handles such nuances, better by focusing on causality and outcomes rather than absolutes. In short, Kant's system presupposes a kind of moral freedom we do not have, whereas deterministic moral forces preserves the structure of ethical rules, do not lie, do not kill, but grounds them in reality. Utilitarianism, consequentialism. Utilitarian ethics associated with thinkers like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, Mill 1863, Bentham 1789, says that the morally right action is the one that maximizes overall well-being, happiness, pleasure, etc., and minimizes suffering. On the surface, this might seem compatible with our outcome-focused approach. Indeed, deterministic moral forces also cares about outcomes. We want to promote well-being and reduce harm, because that is what humans deterministically value. The difference is subtle, but important. Utilitarianism often treats maximize happiness as if it were an objective imperative in itself, like a mathematical formula everyone ought to follow. But why ought we maximize happiness? Utilitarians might say, because happiness is inherently good, that inherently is where they quietly assume a value. In our framework, happiness is not inherently good as a cosmic truth. It is good because we beings desire it due to who we are. We rephrase maximize well-being as a descriptive principle. People will tend to enforce behaviors that increase well-being because it serves their nature. Classical utilitarianism can also get very abstract and sometimes counterintuitive, for example in scenarios where sacrificing one innocent person to save many is endorsed. Utilitarianism says yes, do it, which conflicts with many people's moral intuitions or rights-based thinking. The deterministic view can reach similar conclusions about sacrificing one for many when necessary, but it does not claim this follows from an objective utility calculus. It is because, causally, saving more lives at the cost of fewer aligns with the overall drive of a society to preserve itself. Our framework yields utilitarian-flavored outcomes without committing to utilitarianism's assumption that maximum utility is a standalone, moral truth. We ground it instead. Why maximize well-being? Because that is literally what every person and every society is going to try to do by their nature. Religious or divine command ethics. Religious morality posits that moral rules come from a deity or scripture. X is wrong because God says so, or we have these commandments that define good and evil. We've partly covered this under the contingency guillotine discussion. Divine commands are by nature contingent on God's existence. and will. But from a deterministic perspective, there's another angle. Even if a God exists, followers still only adhere to moral rules because of deterministic factors. A believer obeys a commandment due to upbringing, fear of punishment, hope for reward, psychological propensity for faith, etc. All causes. It's not like the existence of a divine rule suddenly grants humans free will to follow it. They will follow or not follow based on causes, which believers might call grace or temptation or whatnot, but those are just other words for influences. So a deterministic analysis can actually include religious moral behavior. Why do certain moral norms endure? Because religions have served as vehicles for social cohesion, etc. But importantly, we do not need a divine command to explain morality. As we've shown, societies will develop don't kill, don't steal, be fair on their own, because such rules work. Religions often codified these, adding supernatural justification to ensure compliance. But the underlying reason the rules make sense is not because God said so, but because of their earthly effects. Moreover, if a purported divine command goes against human well-being, say, a command to persecute a minority, deterministic morality would judge it by its consequences, suffering, conflict, and find it wanting, whereas a pure divine command theory would force adherence regardless of harm. In DMF, no rule, not even sacred ones, is above evaluation by consequences and causal reality. This makes it more adaptable and humane, whereas religious systems can become cruel or outdated if followed dogmatically. In highlighting these, we see a common thread. Traditional systems assume or require something unprovable, free will, intrinsic values, a God, to get off the ground. They also tend to encounter dilemmas and contradictions. Deontology can be inflexible, never lie, even if lying saves a life. Utilitarianism can justify troubling actions, sacrifice one for many, even in cold-blooded ways. Religion can sanctify harmful practices, holy wars. Discrimination believed to be divinely sanctioned. Deterministic moral forces, by contrast, is both more modest and more consistent. We assume nothing beyond the physical reality of cause and effect and the nature of human beings. We never have to say just because to a skeptic we can always point to a reason in terms of outcomes or causal necessity. When a moral rule and reality conflict, we side with reality. Traditional systems sometimes double down on the rule, reality be damned, leading to absurd or tragic results. A good example of our framework's superiority is how it handles moral dilemmas. Let's consider one of the most famous moral thought experiments, the trolley problem. 8.7 The Trolley Problem Revisited. Moral clarity through determinism. Imagine the classic scenario. A runaway trolley is heading towards 5 people, tied on the tracks. You stand by a lever that can divert the trolley onto another track where only one person is tied. Do you pull the lever to save 5 lives at the cost of 1 life? This dilemma pits a deontological intuition. Killing is wrong, so don't actively cause a death, against a consequentialist intuition. Saving 5 is better than 1. People agonize over it. Moral theories give different answers, and neither answer feels completely satisfying in traditional terms. Foot. 1967. Thompson, 1976. Now let's apply our deterministic moral framework to the trolley problem. How does it change the analysis? First, determinism strips away the cloud of guilt and blame that often makes the trolley problem hard. In a traditional view, if you pull the lever, you have actively caused a death, and might be labeled a murderer, with all the moral condemnation that carries. If you don't pull it, you allowed 5 to die, when you could have saved them, which feels wrong, but also you didn't do anything except let events play out. People's reluctance to pull the lever often stems from the feeling of personal moral culpability for the one death. We naturally fear the responsibility of causing harm, even for a greater good, because society conditions us to do no harm. In the deterministic view, however, the issue of personal blame is greatly reduced. You are not a freely choosing murderer if you pull the lever. You are an instrument of causality making a tragic but calculated decision. The one person's death is a consequence of the situation, not of some evil intent or moral failing on your part. You would not be viewed as a villain deserving punishment, rather. You'd be seen as someone who unfortunately had to cause harm to prevent a greater harm. Society, in a deterministic framework, would likely endorse the lever, pull in a pragmatic sense. 5 lives saved at the cost of 1 is clearly the better outcome. And since outcomes are what matter, that's the morally correct action. There would be compassion for the one lost, and for you in having to make that choice, but not a witch hunt to punish you for murder. By focusing on outcomes and stripping away the illusion of metaphysical guilt, the deterministic framework provides moral clarity. It's better to save 5 lives at the expense of 1 life. The calculation is not done coldly or without regret, but it is straightforward. In effect, the right action in this dilemma is whichever action results in less total harm. Because moral rightness is defined by harm reduction in our framework. There is no absolute rule, do not kill, that overrides common sense in a specific scenario like this. Do not kill is a rule that serves harm reduction in general. But here, sticking to it by not acting would actually increase harm. Deterministic morality has no issue overriding a general rule when context demands it, because the rules are recognized as tools, not inviolable edicts. Consider how different this is from a purely objective rule system. A strict deontologist might say, I cannot pull the lever, killing is wrong, period. I will not actively cause a death. This stance upholds an objective-sounding rule, but at the cost of 5 lives, which seems morally perverse when you think about consequences. A strict utilitarian might say, of course, pull the lever, calculus demands it. But then might also say, and if that one person was myself or my child, I must still do it dispassionately. Deterministic morality would also lean toward pulling the lever, but it allows for the human element. It understands the emotional difficulty. It doesn't demand you be a cold utility maximizer. It simply notes that given we want to save lives, pulling the lever is the better path. If someone couldn't bring themselves to pull it, due to emotional anguish, we de-understand that as a determined reaction too. Our empathy might freeze us, but we'd still collectively recognize the better outcome that could have been. Furthermore, in a deterministic ethic, we might work ahead of time to avoid such dilemmas. The trolley problem is a contrived scenario with no win-win. A society that embraces deterministic thinking would focus on preventative structures. Why are people tied to tracks in the first place? How can we install automatic brakes or fail-safes on trolleys? It sounds like I'm dodging the hypothetical, but it highlights an important mindset. Deterministic morality emphasizes designing systems to minimize no-win situations. When we see these dilemmas, the lesson is not just what do we do in that moment, but how did we get there, and how to not get there again. This is the event horizon concept from earlier. Don't wait until you're at an impossible choice. Intervene upstream. In a way, the best answer to the trolley problem, in a deterministic framework, is, ideally, redesign the system, so such a scenario is extremely unlikely. Nevertheless, if faced with it, the deterministic moral actor assesses causally. 5 lives lost versus 1 life lost. There's no karma or eternal sin attached to being the one who flips the switch. If anything, the person flipping the switch is somewhat heroic. They are willing to bear the trauma of causing a death to save 5 others. And indeed, in most public opinion, surveys more people say they would pull the lever, which aligns with consequentialist thinking, but feel uneasy about it. The unease comes from remnants of the old moral intuitions. Our framework would try to alleviate that by reframing the act not as a sin, but as a sad necessity. Now consider a variant. The fat man variant. Push 1 large man off a bridge to stop the trolley, saving 5 on the track. People are more averse to this, because it feels more like direct murder. In deterministic terms, it's the same calculus, 1 life versus 5, yet most hesitate because physically pushing someone to their death feels more intentional, more murderous. Deterministic morality would again focus on outcome. If that truly is the only way to save 5%, it's justified by consequences. But importantly, it would also examine why we have such an aversion, likely because evolution and social learning have ingrained in us a taboo against personal violence, which usually serves us well. In the rare trolley case, that ingrained response misfires, because the unusual scenario flips the usual script. Usually, not killing is the best way to minimize harm. Here, killing one prevents more killing. Recognizing this as a deterministic quirk of our psychology can help us make a clear decision despite our gut feelings. In sum, the trolley problem highlights how a deterministic framework can cut through moral paradoxes. There is no absolute moral law being broken by pulling the lever, nor are we beholden to some abstract principle at the expense of lives. We simply analyze the causal scenario and choose the path of less harm. And importantly, after the fact, we don't indulge in recrimination or moral outrage at the person who made the hard choice. We understand why it was done. In a punishment-based ethic, one might bizarrely consider punishing the lever puller for killing the one. Since our law might say homicide is illegal, even if it saves others, without some justification. In our ethic, the justification is built in. Saving 5 is better. Case closed. No punishment needed. In fact, a deterministic justice system would likely formally exonerate or even commend the act, much as we do in legal systems with the doctrine of necessity or self-defense, but with even less ambiguity. To connect back to our earlier critique of other systems, a purely objective rule system fails here because it can't adapt. Killing is wrong yields a tragic outcome. A purely punishment-oriented mindset might focus on the fact that you murdered one person and feel an urge to punish or guilt trip, which misses the larger picture. Deterministic morality succeeds by being flexible and context-sensitive. It treats moral decisions as cause-effect problems. Sometimes the least bad option, still involves doing something normally bad, but determinism lets us see that in context, it was the right, determined move. With the trolley problem resolved in principle, we can proceed to the broader, real-world applications of deterministic ethics, how it reshapes our view of justice, social policy, and personal conduct. These are the arenas where the rubber meets the road for any moral theory. And as we'll see, a deterministic approach provides not only clarity in thought experiments, but compassion and effectiveness in practice. 8.8 Justice in a Determined World, from Retribution to Rehabilitation. Perhaps the most immediate and emotional application of morality is in our justice systems. Society must deal with those who harm others. Traditionally, justice has been heavily tied to the idea of retribution. Wrongdoers should suffer because they chose to do wrong. We've already argued that this idea doesn't hold up under determinism. If criminals don't truly choose to be criminal in a vacuum, punishing them as moral offenders is misguided. So what does justice look like through the deterministic lens? Justice becomes a matter of cause and effect management, not moral vengeance. The goal of a justice system in a deterministic framework is not to inflict suffering on the wicked to balance some cosmic scales. It's to protect society and reduce future harm by addressing the causes and effects of harmful behavior. This leads to a very different attitude. Punishment is not an end in itself. We don't ask, what does this offender deserve? We ask, what action will lead to the best outcome now? Sometimes that might mean incarceration, but not to make them suffer, rather to prevent further harm or to rehabilitate. Sometimes it might mean mandated therapy, community service, education, or other interventions. If a thief stole due to poverty, perhaps the solution is economic opportunity rather than a jail term. If a violent offender has a mental illness, treatment might be more effective than punishment. Rehabilitation and deterrence over retribution. A deterministic system focuses on rehabilitation, changing the person's future behavior by reforming them, and deterrence, using consequences to dissuade others from similar acts as reasons for corrective action. Retribution, eye for an eye, is seen as primitive and unjustifiable, except insofar as it might accidentally serve deterrence. If inflicting some penalty doesn't help reform the person or deter others or safeguard society, then it's simply cruelty. For example, executing or harshly punishing someone for a crime might satisfy some people's sense of revenge, but it could be completely counterproductive if that person could be turned into a law-abiding citizen through other means. Or, if the harsh punishment doesn't actually deter others, studies often show extreme punishments don't effectively deter crime more than milder ones. Acknowledging mitigation and causality. Modern justice already, to a limited extent, acknowledges causality. We consider mitigating factors like duress, insanity, or a difficult childhood when sentencing. Deterministic justice would amplify this. Every crime is understood in context. This doesn't mean people get a free pass because it's not their fault. We still need to protect society. But it means the response is tailored to circumstances. Someone who did wrong due to desperation might get a very different response than someone who did wrong out of calculated greed, because those are different causal scenarios requiring different fixes. Under determinism, we see both as products of cause and effect, but we also see that to change their future behavior, we must alter their circumstances or mindset. Imagine a deterministic justice system at work. Take prisons. In many countries, prisons are primarily punitive, harsh. Places meant to make offenders suffer for what they did. In a deterministic framework, that approach seems not only cruel but foolish, because making someone suffer doesn't inherently make them a better person when they get out. It might actually traumatize them further or harden criminal tendencies. So a deterministic prison, if prison is even needed, would look much more like the systems in Norway or other progressive countries, focused on education, therapy, skill building, and reintegration into society. Indeed, those countries today provide a real-world model that aligns with deterministic thinking. For example, Norway's prisons emphasize rehabilitation and humane treatment. Their recidivism, reoffense, rates are around 20%. Even the concept of deserve shifts. Does a murderer deserve life in prison or death? In our view, that question is wrong-headed. The murderer should be kept away from society as long as they are a threat and should be rehabilitated if possible. It's not about what they deserve, it's about what future we want to create. If, hypothetically, we had technology to instantly reform a murderer into a peaceful, empathetic person, a deterministic ethic would say, use it. Don't keep punishing the reformed person for the sake of the past. Traditional retributive ethics might still demand some suffering to pay for the crime. But that's exactly the kind of irrational hangover determinism tells us to drop. As a thought experiment, if a criminal could sincerely apologize and understand they're wrong, and we could undo the harm caused, imagine even resurrecting a victim with sci-fi tech. Would we still need to punish? Retributivists might grapple with whether wrong must be paid for. Determinists would say no, the balance is restored, move on. Moral responsibility doesn't disappear, it transforms. We still hold people responsible in that we hold them as the locus where change must occur. You did this, so you will be subject to interventions. But we don't attach metaphysical blame. It's similar to how we handle, say, a dangerous dog. If a dog bites people, we don't think it's morally evil, but we will still restrain or train it for safety. While humans are far more complex and we treat them with dignity, the core idea is we respond to the behavior's causes and effects, not to a presumed evil will. This has a humanizing effect. Paradoxically, viewing someone as determined can make us more compassionate. Instead of labeling a criminal as simply a bad person, We might see a person who had a cascade of influences that led to a bad outcome. We might feel pity or sympathy rather than hatred, even as we firmly intervene to prevent harm. That shift in attitude can also affect how effectively we rehabilitate them. If you treat someone as capable of change and as a human being, they're more likely to respond to reform. One might worry, if we go too far with this, do we risk being soft on crime? Deterministic morality says, be effective on crime. Sometimes that means very robust intervention. If someone is truly dangerous and cannot be rehabilitated at present, protecting society could mean they are isolated permanently, what traditional system would call a life sentence. But we'd frame as indefinite containment for public safety. The difference is, we wouldn't do it to hurt them. We'd do it because we must prevent harm. If later we find a way to rehabilitate or mitigate the danger, we would revisit and possibly release them. So it's neither soft nor hard. It's smart and adaptive. In fact, deterrence, one of the valid reasons for punishment, still operates under determinism. People are deterred by consequences because consequences shape behavior, cause and effect. If knowing that, you will definitely be caught and sent to a very effective rehabilitation program. With some loss of freedom, meanwhile, deters you. Great. If not, perhaps stricter, immediate measures are needed. But even deterrence is a forward-looking rationale. We apply consequences to influence future actions, not to balance a moral book. We also explore alternatives in a deterministic spirit if we discover, for example, that certain neurotechnological treatments could reduce criminal impulses. A deterministic ethic would consider using them carefully, with respect for individual rights as much as possible, as part of justice. Because if crime has physiological contributors, then medicine might be better than punishment. These are delicate areas, but ignoring them because of a myth of absolute responsibility isn't wise either. In short, justice becomes about engineering better behavior and safer societies, not about casting sinners into hellfire. This makes it more compassionate and, ultimately, more effective. We already see hints of this in movements toward restorative justice, where offenders meet victims, make amends, and rehabilitative justice. Deterministic moral forces gives a strong philosophical foundation for those trends. With justice addressed, we can step back to an even wider view. How do we shape society itself to embody these principles? That brings us to the realm of policy and collective responsibility. 8.9% preventing harm at the roots, shaping society through deterministic ethics. If individuals aren't sole authors of their actions, but rather participants in a web of causes, then moral responsibility isn't just an individual affair, it's deeply collective. Society itself bears responsibility for the conditions that give rise to good or bad outcomes. Recognizing this shifts our ethical focus upstream. Rather than just reacting to bad behavior after it happens, we aim to prevent bad behavior, and bad outcomes generally, by arranging the determinants in favor of the good. This perspective could revolutionize public policy. Consider major social ills: crime, poverty, addiction, even ignorance. The traditional moralizing approach might say, crime is caused by bad people making bad choices. Poverty might be blamed on laziness, addiction on lack of willpower, ignorance on lack of trying. A deterministic approach says no, these problems have causes, and if we address the causes, we solve the problems. We remove the moralistic finger-wagging and treat it as a practical issue of inputs and outputs. Examples of shaping conditions: education and opportunity. If a lack of education and opportunity is found to correlate with higher crime rates, and it does, then providing better schooling, job training, and economic opportunities in at-risk communities is not just a nice social policy, it's a moral imperative under determinism. It's how we engineer fewer criminals. You don't want as much crime? Improve the determinants. Don't wait to punish a poorly educated, desperate person for robbing someone. Try to ensure fewer people become desperate and uneducated in the first place. Healthcare and mental health. Many harmful behaviors stem from untreated mental illness or addiction, which itself is often self-medication for trauma. A deterministic ethic pushes us to invest heavily in mental health care, addiction treatment, and overall healthcare. It's much more effective and humane to treat depression or schizophrenia, thus preventing possible violence or self-harm that could result, than to jail someone after a breakdown. If we know childhood trauma increases the likelihood of future aggression or crime, then providing therapy and support for traumatized children is a moral duty of society. Economic structure, poverty, and inequality can fuel crime, reduce trust, and generally harm social cohesion. A deterministic approach doesn't see poor people as morally inferior or rich people as morally superior. It sees an unequal system that predictably produces certain moral outcomes: desperation, crime, resentment. Thus, it calls for structural changes, maybe a stronger safety net, universal basic income, job programs, fairer wages. The idea is to design out the conditions that breed what we call immoral behavior. Urban planning and environment. Even factors like how cities are built or what environments people grow up in can influence behavior. Poorly lit streets increase crime opportunities, lack of community spaces can diminish social bonds, etc. Every field becomes an avenue for moral action: architecture, city planning, media, technology, each can be used to nudge society toward better outcomes. For example, there's research suggesting that simple changes, like adding greenery to neighborhoods, can reduce stress and aggression. A deterministic morality takes that seriously. Planting trees becomes a tiny piece of crime prevention and well-being promotion, not just beautification. This idea isn't about a nanny state or heavy-handed social engineering in the dystopian sense. It's about recognizing our collective power and responsibility to shape the world that in turn shapes us. We do this all the time, albeit piecemeal. Existential logicism is urging us to do it consciously as a moral project. Instead of arguing at the level of people should behave better, we ask what conditions help people behave better. Then we implement those. The metaphor used earlier in the event horizon discussion captures it well. Don't wait until a person is at the cliff's edge of a bad choice. Guide their path long before they get there. If you know a particular neighborhood yields a lot of high school dropouts who join gangs, intervene when those kids are 5, 6, 7 years old with extra support, mentors, resources. If you know certain patterns lead to bankruptcy and financial ruin, educate and regulate to protect people from predatory traps. Essentially, widen the path, add guardrails, and give people, determined as they are, the best possible shot to lead constructive lives. Systems, not just individuals, bear moral accountability. In a deterministic moral view, it makes sense to say the system failed just as much as to say the individual failed. If a corporation designs an algorithm that ends up spreading misinformation and inciting violence, think of social media issues. That corporation and its algorithm design are part of the causal chain for immoral outcomes. They have moral responsibility in the causal sense. They ought to modify the algorithm, and indeed, we ought to regulate such things, because otherwise we're just letting a harmful cause run rampant and then blaming individuals who get influenced. Another example, if the law overly criminalizes certain minor behaviors, leading to mass incarceration, as seen with harsh drug laws, the law itself is a moral failing of the system. Under determinism, changing the law is as much a moral action as telling people don't do drugs. More so, perhaps, because laws we can change directly. This collective focus doesn't absolve individuals from participating in moral improvement. After all, individuals are the ones who make up the systems. But it reminds each of us that our moral duties extend beyond our personal choices. If you're a policymaker, designing fair policies is a moral duty. If you're a business leader, creating a humane corporate culture, knowing your decisions affect employee well-being and behavior, is a moral duty. Even as a voter or citizen, supporting evidence-based policies over punitive quick fixes is a moral choice. Deterministic morality aligns with the idea of doing what works ethically. It's inherently empirical. Try approaches, measure outcomes, adjust accordingly. For example, if decriminalizing certain offenses and focusing on treatment shows better results, as has been seen with drug decriminalization in some countries, then that is the moral path because it reduces harm and improves lives. Old moralists might protest, but using drugs is wrong. We can't go easy on it. The deterministic answer, what matters is reducing addiction and harm, not punishing the wrongdoing. If easing off punishment achieves the goal better, then that's the morally right thing to do. Our loyalty is to results, not to dogma. In effect, morality becomes a dynamic, self-correcting system, much like science. We have hypotheses, for example. Providing free school lunch will reduce theft or behavioral issues among kids. We test them, and we adopt what works. Contrast this with ideologically driven morality, where you might insist on a rule or policy even if it consistently fails, because you believe in it. Deterministic ethics has no patience for that kind of stagnation. It's also an optimistic view. It implies that many of our worst problems are solvable if we muster the will to tackle the causes. We're not resigned to bad people exist. Evil is a mystery. We say, bad outcomes have causes. Let's eliminate the causes. There will always be challenges. New causes can arise, and complexity is high, but there's nothing in principle that's off limits to improvement. This echoes the spirit of Enlightenment thinking, but without the naive idea that everyone is rational. Here we acknowledge people are not freely rational. They're shaped, so we shape the shaping influences. Finally, what about technology? The technological moral responsibility. In our context, is that technology is just another set of tools that massively influence conditions. Using technology ethically becomes crucial. For instance, automating away drudgery and providing abundance, ending artificial scarcity, could eliminate a lot of theft or conflict born from competition over resources. That's a moral use of tech. Conversely, technology used to manipulate or exploit people's weaknesses, say apps designed to be addictive or surveillance that oppresses, is immoral because of its deterministic impacts. So, guiding tech development toward harm reduction and empowerment fits right into our framework. We've painted a picture of societies striving to preempt moral problems by tackling root causes. But morality isn't only a social or systemic matter, it also lives in the everyday. Choices of each person. So our final piece of the puzzle is the question, how should I, as an individual who doesn't have free will, live and act morally? Let's address personal ethics under determinism. 8.10, Living Morally, Without Free Will, Personal Ethics Reimagined. If every choice I make is determined, what's the point of trying to be a good person? This is a question that often arises when people first encounter the idea of determinism. The worry is that it sounds like fatalism. If it's all predetermined, why not just let things happen? But determinism is not fatalism. Fatalism is the idea that outcomes will happen no matter what, so our efforts don't matter. Determinism says outcomes have specific causes, including our efforts. In fact, our deliberation and efforts are part of the causal chain that leads to outcomes. So living morally still very much matters, because whether you deliberate ethically or not will affect what you do, which will affect the world. From a first-person perspective, you will still experience life as making choices. Knowing philosophically that those choices are determined doesn't change the fact that you have to go through the process of deciding what to do. Think of it like this. A chess-playing robot might be completely deterministic, but it still decides each move based on computations. Similarly, we decide based on our mental computations. Understanding determinism just encourages us to program those computations through habit, education, reflection in the best way possible. So how do we approach personal ethics if we adopt determinism? 1. Embrace practical agency, drop ultimate agency. You, as a person, obviously have the capacity to consider options and pick one. Determinism doesn't tell you to stop doing that. It tells you why you're doing that, and that ultimately there was only one outcome once all inputs were set, but you don't know the outcome until you go through the decision process. So you keep acting as an agent. You weigh pros and cons, you reflect on consequences, you attempt to restrain harmful impulses and encourage kind ones. What you drop is the egoistic notion that I could at this moment do something completely contrary to my character or reasons. No, you won't, and that's okay. Your focus shifts from willing the right thing in the moment to cultivating the right causes in yourself over time. For example, if I want to be honest, but I often lie out of habit or fear. Under determinism, I recognize that just trying really hard in the moment might not work, because my tendency to lie is caused by anxiety perhaps. Instead, I work on the causes. Maybe I practice honesty in low-stakes situations to build confidence, or I address the fear that leads me to lie. I basically re-engineer my environment and mind incrementally, tell friends to hold me accountable, remove temptations to lie, etc. It's like acknowledging I'm a machine that can be tinkered with, rather than a magic spirit that can just decide to be different spontaneously. 2. Compassion for self and others. Personal determinism can actually be freeing in terms of guilt and judgment. If you make a mistake or do something you regret, beating yourself up endlessly with "I'm horrible, I freely chose to do bad," isn't productive. Instead, a healthier response is, okay, I did that because of XYZ factors. How can I change those factors in the future so I don't do it again? You take responsibility in a causal way without drowning in shame. Same with others. If someone wrongs you, you still hold them accountable. You don't just let it slide necessarily, but you can also understand they're a product of causes. This can reduce bitterness and desire for revenge. For instance, if someone cuts you off in traffic and you're angered, you might consider maybe they're having a bad day or a personal emergency. Something caused them to act rudely. It diffuses the situation emotionally. An objective scorecard. Morality becomes about improving outcomes, not achieving saintliness. You won't go to hell for failing, nor to heaven for succeeding. Rather, if you slack in moral behavior, consequences will play out in real time. You might hurt relationships, feel internal discord, etc. And if you act better, you'll likely see benefits, trust from others, personal satisfaction, better results. So your motivation to be moral comes from understanding those causal connections, not from a guilt trip or a celestial reward. You essentially become a moral scientist of your own life, noticing what actions lead to better states and trying to do more of those. 4. Avoid judgmentalism and embrace understanding. When you understand that people are products of their circumstances, you become less quick to judge harshly. This doesn't mean you lack moral discernment. You still recognize when something is harmful or wrong, but you don't attach the same scorn to the person. You might criticize the action, "That was hurtful, and I can't allow it." While still retaining empathy for the individual, "I see how you got there. Let's try to work through it." This approach can improve personal relationships. Parents, for example, might discipline their children with a clearer head. Instead of "My kid was bad out of defiance, I must punish." It's "My kid did something harmful. What caused that, and how can I address the cause?" Perhaps the child is seeking attention, or is confused, or mimicking something. The response then can be more constructive. 5. Focus on intentions and outcomes, not abstract goodness. Without free will, the moral worth of a person is not some inherent quality they freely cultivate. It's basically the pattern of their actions and intentions, which come from their character, which comes from causes. So in living morally, you focus on being the kind of person who produces good outcomes. That means cultivating compassion, knowledge, and discipline, all the attributes that typically lead to beneficial actions. If you understand that, for example, unchecked anger in you leads to harming loved ones, you morally work on your anger, maybe via therapy or meditation, or simply habits. The point isn't to prove you're a good person. It's literally to cause less pain. This is a subtle shift. It makes morality less about image or identity and more about practical effect. Someone might strongly self-identify as virtuous, yet leave a trail of hurt due to arrogance. Deterministic ethics would say that self-identification is meaningless if the outcomes are bad. Better to quietly adjust your behavior so outcomes improve, regardless of what label you or others put on you. 6. Use understanding of determinism as a tool, not an excuse. A potential pitfall: if everything's determined, can I just say, oh well, that's just how I am, and not try to change? That would be a misinterpretation. Yes, you're determined by current factors, but you're also capable of change through new factors. And knowing about determinism is itself a new factor that can influence you. Think of it this way: if I know I have a short temper because of stress, I can start going to the gym to manage stress. That decision arises from understanding cause and effect. So rather than excuse yourself, you actually become more strategic about changing yourself. You kind of take a third-person view of your first-person self. Given who I am, what's likely to make me a bit more patient or honest or courageous over time? Then you implement it. Maybe it's seeking different friends or reading certain books or consciously reflecting each day. All those choices will also be determined by your new belief in self-improvement, perhaps, but they are choices you experience and which alter your trajectory. At the same time, you won't indulge in moral hypocrisy as easily. If I do something wrong, I can't say I could have done otherwise, I just chose not to. Instead, I say I did that. It reflects something in me or my situation that I need to address. In a way, it's more honest. People often use the belief in free will to excuse themselves. I could do the right thing, I just didn't feel like it, which is a way to hold on to a self-image of being good in potential, even if not in actuality. Determinism is like, no, you are your actions. If you didn't do the right thing, then those potentialities don't count until they manifest. But the upside is, you can manifest them by changing conditions. So get to work kindly. 7. Finding meaning and motivation. Some worry that if things are determined, life loses meaning. On the contrary, understanding how things work can give a deeper sense of meaning. You are part of a vast causal tapestry, and what you do echoes in that web. Every action you take has ripples. Even if there's no ultimate cosmic score, you have the very real significance of influencing others' lives and your own environment. Many deterministic philosophies, like certain Buddhist teachings, for example, find great meaning in compassion and wisdom, precisely because they alleviate suffering in this interconnected web. Existential Logicism says we create meaning through our commitments and actions. Deterministic morality gives a clear criterion for one kind of meaning, contributing positively to the world in ways that can be observed and felt. Finally, living morally without free will invites a certain humility. We realize there, but for circumstances, I might have ended up very differently if I had different genes or upbringing. This humility fosters tolerance and peace. It also fosters gratitude. You recognize all the ways luck or help from others shaped your good qualities, so you feel grateful and perhaps obligated to pay it forward, since others' fates are still being written by present circumstances. In summary, individual ethics under determinism means actively engaging in self-shaping and world-shaping behaviors with the knowledge of why those behaviors matter. We still avoid doing harm, still try to be honest, kind, courageous. Those virtues remain, but we justify them not by saying because I freely choose to be virtuous, but because these virtues have positive effects on myself and others. And if we fail, we don't waste time with self-loathing, we analyze and adjust. It's a very practical, almost engineering approach to one's moral life, but it doesn't lack warmth. Indeed, compassion becomes central. Now we have assembled all the pieces, from the dismantling of objective morality to the assertion of determinism, from the illusion of free will to the reimagining of justice, society, and personal life. It's time to tie it all together and state clearly why this deterministic moral framework is not just another theory, but arguably a more coherent, effective, and human approach to ethics than any that has come before. 8.1 conclusion: morality as an emergent pattern of deterministic forces. We began with the wreckage of objective, free will-based morality, and from it we have constructed a new edifice, deterministic moral forces. Let's highlight what we've achieved in this construction. A logically consistent framework. We resolved the is-ought divide gap by showing that oughts are grounded in the reality of what we are and what outcomes we seek. We eliminated internal contradictions that plagued prior systems, like punishing people as if they had absolute choice while knowing they didn't. Our moral framework doesn't require belief in anything supernatural or unprovable. It only asks us to accept what science and experience tell us. Cause and effect reign in human behavior. An emergent, not imposed, morality. Instead of morality being a foreign element imposed by gods or abstract principles, it emerges naturally. We view moral rules as real and important, but real in the way language or culture is real, not in the way atoms are real. They exist because we exist and interact. This makes morality ours, a human project, which paradoxically makes it more meaningful. We care about it because it arises from our cares. A focus on outcomes and reduction of harm. By dropping pretenses of cosmic justice, we can focus like a laser on what actually causes suffering or flourishing. The ethical question shifts from what is right in itself to what works to produce the world we want to live in. This is a more answerable question. It makes ethics a shared enterprise of learning and cooperation. Compassion and understanding at its core, knowing that everyone is a product of circumstances, encourages empathy. It tones down anger, hatred, and self-righteousness, which in traditional moral disputes often inflame conflict. A deterministic society might be more forgiving, while still being firm against harm. That combination, forgiving of the person, firm on the act, is powerful. It is what allows restorative justice, reconciliation, and true rehabilitation. Adaptability and growth. Because we don't cling to dogmatic rules, a deterministic moral system can evolve with new evidence and conditions. Morality becomes a continuous improvement process. This adaptability means it can handle new moral dilemmas, like those arising from technology or changing social norms, without the angst of, but is it allowed by scripture or tradition? The only measure is, does it reduce harm and align with our rational goals? If yes, it's good. If no, it's not. If uncertain, experiment and find out. Consistency with human psychology, rather than demanding people transcend their nature. Free will ethics, sometimes S, expects people to make choices utterly contrary to all inclination just out of duty. Deterministic ethics works with human nature. It says, for example, people need praise and encouragement to do well, so it encourages positive reinforcement rather than constant criticism. It acknowledges biases and works around them. It's a very human morality, not an idealized angelic one. By being honest about who we are, it stands a better chance of actually influencing behavior effectively. A unifying perspective. Determinism bridges the gap between individual and society, between is and ought, between science and morality. We no longer see human behavior as this mysterious domain apart from the rest of the world. It's of a piece with biology, psychology, sociology. Morality becomes, in a sense, an applied science of human well-being. This doesn't cheapen it. It empowers it. It means moral truths with a small t can be discovered, tested, refined. It also unites us all in a shared fabric. We're all subject to the same forces, so we must collectively navigate them. Some might fear that this framework is cold or overly rational, but consider its fruits. Less vindictiveness, more rehabilitation, less moral posturing, more problem-solving, less judgment, more empathy, less stagnation, more innovation in ethics, and ultimately, less suffering, more flourishing. Those outcomes are anything but cold. They speak to a deeply humane project. In Existential Logicism, deterministic moral forces stands as the final pillar, because it takes the insights from all previous discussions about existence, logic, consciousness, contingency, and applies them to how we live and treat each other. It is the capstone that shows living in truth, the truth of determinism and absurdity of objective given meaning, doesn't lead to despair or immorality. It leads to a clearer, kinder, and more effective morality. We have not created a utopia or a perfect solution to all moral issues. People will still conflict, emotions will still run high, and implementing these ideas is a challenge. But the framework gives us a North Star and a toolbox. It tells us where to aim, a world of less unnecessary suffering, more understanding, and how to correct course when we err, by looking at causes and outcomes, not clinging to blame or rigid rules. To conclude, let's revisit the central claim one last time in plain terms. All morality, behavior, and punishment are products of deterministic forces. What does this imply? It implies that whenever you see a moral situation, a crime, a kindness, a dilemma, you should look for the chain of events that led there and the chain of events that will follow from any response. In those chains lie the answers to what to do. This worldview asks us to take responsibility not in the old sense, own your freely chosen sin, but in a new sense, take responsibility for the part of the causal web that you are. You are not an uncaused causer, but you are a causer nonetheless. You will leave ripples in existence, make them count. Existential Logicism's moral vision is therefore one of enlightened pragmatism. It is precise because it is grounded in understanding real factors, powerful because it can actually change things by attacking root causes, and logical because it removes the incoherence of prior approaches. Yet it is not overly academic or removed from life. It is life, viewed courageously as it is and guided deliberately toward what it could be. In embracing deterministic moral forces, we do not throw up our hands and say everything is fated. We roll up our sleeves and say, if everything is caused, then let's become the most skillful causes we can be. Each of us, and all of us together, can be the forces that determine a better moral reality. This is morality without myth. Morality for a world where humans finally understand ourselves, not as angels or demons, but as determined beings who, through that very understanding, can create a more just and compassionate society. 8.12 Formal Derivation. DMF is ought representation. In the main text, we analyze the deterministic moral forces use of ought as a structural relation between an agent's valuational profile, beliefs, available options, and the deterministic dynamics of the world. The following theorem collects that analysis in formal form. Definition 8.19. base description of an agent at a time, for an agent A at time t in a deterministic world W with evolution function f. Define the base description of A at t as the quadruple. Da t equal to valet, bella, t, axa, tf, where valet is the agent's valuational structure, how the agent ranks possible world trajectories or conditions. Bella, t, is the agent's belief state at t, their model of which trajectories are possible, and how f propagates states. Axe, t, is the set of actions the agent treats as available at t. F is the deterministic evolution function on complete present states of W, as inherited from the persistent present chapter. All of these are descriptive features of the world, and the agent as a physical functional system. Definition 8.20. Deterministic moral forces internal ought. Fix an agent A at time t with base description DAT, as in definition 819. For any action A acts AT, we say that ought T, A, holds red, A ought at T, to do A, in the deterministic moral forces sense if and only if, for every alternative B acts A, T, the world trajectories that A, perhaps imperfectly, expects to follow from doing A are ranked by valet, at least as highly as those expected to follow from doing B. Intuitively, A is a valor-maximizing option among the actions the agent currently regards as open, given what they, deterministically, believe about how the world works. Theorem 807, internal is-ought representation in deterministic moral forces. 8.6, let W be a deterministic world with agents and base descriptions as above. Consider the fragment of the deterministic moral forces language in which normative vocabulary appears only in atomic formulas of the form A ought at T to do A, understood via definition 8.20. Then for every such atomic ought statement, there exists a purely descriptive condition. Fa, A, vala, bella, T, axa, T, F, formulated in terms of the base description da, T, such that A ought at T to do A is true in W if, and only if, fat, A, vala, bella, T, axa, T, F, is true in W. In particular, once vala, bella, T, axa, T, and F are fixed, there is no further stance-free ought fact left to be settled. The truth value of the deterministic moral forces ought claim is wholly determined by these descriptive ingredients. Proof. By definition 8.2%, the truth conditions for A ought at T to do A are exactly, for every B acts A, T. The trajectories that A, according to Bella T, expects to follow from doing A are ranked by valor, at least as highly as those expected to follow from doing B. Call this condition fire T, A, valor, Bella T, axa, T, F. It is a conjunction of claims about which actions are treats as available at T, axa, T, which trajectories the agent expects each action to lead to, given their beliefs about F, encoded in Bella T. How valor ranks those trajectories. Each of these is part of the base description DAT and involves new currents of normative vocabulary. It follows immediately from the definition that the ought statement is true in W if and only if fear is true in W. There is therefore a 1-1 correspondence at the level of truth conditions between atomic deterministic moral forces ought claims and purely descriptive base language claims about valor, bella, T, axa, T, and F. This establishes the claimed representation. Remark 8.21, scope and status of the is-ought result, theorem 8.6, is an internal is-ought result for existential logicism. It does not claim that one can infer a new stance-free ought from arbitrary purely descriptive premises in the sense targeted by Hume. Instead, it proceeds in 2 steps. 1. Conceptual choice, existential logicism rejects stance free moral properties by the contingency guillotine and defines its own use of ought in terms of valuations, beliefs, options, and dynamics. Definition 8.2 do. 2. Representation. Given that definition, every deterministic moral force's internal ought claim is shown to be truth, conditionally equivalent to a complex, descriptive claim about the base description DAT, theorem 8.6. Critics who insist on a thicker, stance-free real ought can agree that the theorem is correct about the LDMF usage while denying that this captures their preferred concept. In that case, the disagreement is not about the logic of the theorem, but about which concept of ought we should take seriously. Existential logicism's position is that the stance-free notion is incoherent, and the only workable residue is the naturalized agent-relative structure characterized here. Chapter 9. Peace be upon you. And now, at the end, we reflect. We arrive together at the conclusion of our journey through existential logicism, having peeled back, layer after